Hello everybody. Today I have the pleasure of discussing with you Chapter 6 of our book regarding exposure evaluation. Just a quick note to anybody who will review the PowerPoint of this video, the PowerPoint must be viewed in presentation mode. With that being said, let's get started. So let's briefly discuss what we know so far. We have touched upon the public health assessment overview. We have also discussed toxicology and its role in the public health assessment. And just last week, we reviewed exposure evaluation and environmental contamination, as well as some sampling techniques. So again, what we're discussing today is exposure pathways, specifically evaluating exposure pathways. The exposure pathway is a critical early step in the public health assessment processes. So after you're done watching this video, you should be able to define exposure pathways, understand and evaluate the 5 elements of an exposure pathway, and have knowledge of the role of an exposure pathway in the public health assessment. So, what is an exposure pathway? Simply put, an exposure pathway refers to the way a person can come into contact with a hazardous substance. As the schematic shows, an exposure pathway is the link between environmental releases and local populations that might come into contact with the contamination. An exposure pathway evaluation, therefore, determines if site contaminants have been, are, or will be in contact with local population. So what are the 5 elements to consider when evaluating exposure pathway? The first is the containment source or release. Next is environmental fate or transport. Exposure point or area. Exposure route. And potentially exposed populations. All 5 elements of an exposure pathway must be present to consider the pathway complete. I will now go into more detail for each element now. So, element 1, the containment source or release. We want to discuss the origin of the environmental contamination. Exposure pathways always start with a source of contamination. Source of contamination may include drums, tanks, buried wastes, landfills, and so on. You're also going to want to consider the history of the site, as some sites have just one contamination source, but others may have many. Public health assessors review site descriptions and data from other site investigation reports. Studying site plans and maps can provide additional perspective on the exact locations of possible contamination. We also want to identify the affected environmental media. The affected environmental media may serve to transport contaminants from the source to possible points of human exposure. Affected media may include groundwater, soil, air, and so on. Sampling data can be extremely useful in evaluating contaminated media, as you can then begin to ask and hopefully answer questions such as how long has the media been contaminated, what is the extent of contamination, and how has the contamination migrated through the media, and so on. Element 2, evaluating fate and transport of contaminants. Fate and transport refers to how contaminants move through and are transformed in the environment. Simply put, how will the contaminants from the source area find their way to the exposure point? Information used when evaluating fate and transport include the transport process, any physical, chemical, biological factors that may affect transport, and site-specific environmental conditions such as climate and topography. Evaluating fate and transport issues depends on many factors. If the fate and transport issues are difficult to determine, you should use the worst case scenario. And if needed, ask for help and consult with technical experts as related to the exposure pathway, such as hydrologists and air modelers, etc. Now that we've identified the source of contamination and have evaluated how the contaminant may be transported from the source, we have to discuss element 3, exposure point or area. By doing so, we identify points of exposure for each environmental medium, such as groundwater, soil, surface water, sediment, air, food chains, etc. The following matrix, as found in our book, is a useful tool for identifying the most likely exposure scenarios for different combinations of soil contamination. Using such a matrix can help organize your thoughts as you run through multiple exposure scenarios. Next up, element 4, exposure route. In general, individuals may be exposed to contaminants in environmental media in one or more of the following ways: ingestion, inhalation, dermal contact, and even external exposure to radiation, each with their own unique examples. When determining exposure routes, we want to identify which routes are viable for each exposure point. For example, if contaminated groundwater is being supplied to a household, then the residents may be exposed via ingestion by drinking water, inhalation from volatilization of the water during a shower, and dermal contact when taking a shower or a bath. As you can see, the web of an exposure pathway can begin to grow quite quickly. And lastly, element 5, potentially exposed populations. Identifying specific populations that might be exposed to contaminants is a primary component of any exposure pathway evaluation. Both the characteristics and size of the potentially exposed population need to be determined. Though, remember, each site is unique. You're going to attempt to answer questions such as, who is exposed? What activities are occurring? Where are the activities occurring? When has exposure occurred? For how long? How many people are exposed? How is the land used? And there are many unique characteristics and so on. By answering these questions, we can begin to determine and identify populations and characterize their activities. Potentially exposed populations include residential, recreational, worker, transient, and high-risk populations. Therefore, a brief reminder from our book. The presence of a population in the vicinity of a site does not necessarily mean exposure is occurring or has occurred. That is our job to find out. Lastly, for element 5, ATSDR requires that an estimate of the number of potentially exposed people be documented in the public health assessment documents for every exposure pathway. When attempting to do so, just remember to use your available resources. Now that we've discussed the 5 elements of an exposure pathway evaluation, I wanted to play a 1-minute clip of this video that briefly touches upon the Deepwater Horizon's oil spill in late 2013.
7 weeks into the oil spill crisis, there is still confusion and uncertainty about how to protect the people cleaning up the mess. Commercial fisherman George Jackson was overcome by fumes while inspecting boom. BP gave him no protective gear.
They didn't supply us with nothing. Now they starting to disperse gloves and hazmat suits.
Chemicals and vapors, both from oil and dispersants, can pose serious health risks. They can inflame the nose, throat, and lungs and aggravate asthma. When absorbed in the bloodstream, oil compounds like benzene or toluene can cause headaches and dizziness and could have long-term toxic effects on the brain, liver, and kidneys after prolonged direct contact.
So, after watching that clip, think about what is the source or sources of contamination? How is the contaminant being transported through the environment? What is the exposure point and exposure route? Who and or what are the potentially exposed populations? So the last portion of this presentation discusses presenting exposure pathway information. You want to remember that you are trying to create a public health story. Discuss each exposure pathway by explaining how contaminants migrated from the source to the point of exposure. Describe how human exposure occurs at the point of exposure and delineate areas of potential exposure. Using tables may help you organize your findings. Summarize the results of the exposure pathway evaluated in tabular format. Indicate the contaminated media involved, points of exposure, routes of exposure, and potentially exposed populations. You may want to consider using a site conceptual model, which helps you envision how people might come into contact with environmental contamination. Developing a site conceptual model early in the public health assessment process ultimately will help you prioritize pathway evaluations. You may use visual schematics, such as this figure, which details how contaminants from the source, that being a pile of leaking drums, can find their way to potentially exposed populations. Or you may use diagrams. This figure lists the same information as the previous figure, but in an alternate fashion. In summary, exposure pathway evaluation is a critical early step in the public health assessment process. The goal is to identify likely site-specific exposure situations, and understanding the 5 elements of an exposure pathway and how to present the information is key. Finally, these are my discussion questions, which have also been posted in Blackboard, and thank you.